All right, guys. Today, we're going to give you an overview of the female menstrual cycle to establish a really good foundation going forward so that we can get into more of the practical applications of how you as a female can best support your training and nutrition during different phases of your cycle. So let's go ahead and jump in. Gina, give us a broad overview. What is the menstrual cycle? And then we'll dive into phases and all of that.
Yeah, so really the menstrual cycle is, for lack of simpler terms, it can range anywhere from 24 to 35 days. So that anywhere within that range is normal. Now, kind of the caveat here is normal for you might be 24 days. Normal for me might be 35 days. However, we don't want that to vary more than 1 to 3 days. So if you're someone who you're typically like 24 to 25 days, that's awesome. You shouldn't be jumping all over that range. So as long as you're within the 24 to 35 days, and your cycle on a monthly basis isn't ranging by more than 1 to 3 days, we would consider that a normal menstrual cycle. Mm-hmm. And so when you're thinking about just the menstrual cycle as a whole, day 1 is considered when you start to bleed. So if you're trying to track your menstrual cycle, day 1 is the first day you have a bleed. That is the bleeding phase. So we have that phase. Right from there, we go into the follicular phase, which they're kind of the follicular phase accompanies the bleeding phase, and then we go into the luteal phase. So there's really 3 phases, but the bleeding phase is intertwined with the follicular phase. Mm-hmm. And so when you're sorry, did you interject?
You're good. You're good. I don't want to interrupt you. I'm going to interject. You're the one that knows a ton more than me on this. But so I know there's a lot of conflicting information out there. Like some people say 21 days to 35 days is normal. I've heard the 24, what you just said. But yeah. As far as, and then some people also say there's 4 phases, right? If you include ovulation. So bleeding, follicular, ovulation, and then luteal. So I'm clarifying for people who might have seen something different because I 100% just the caveats. So,
yes. And the thing about your menstrual cycle is that ovulation is the main event. So if you are not ovulating, then that would be called an anovulatory cycle. And so really what we're looking for with having a cycle is not the bleed itself. That's kind of the byproduct. What we're looking for is ovulation. So just to circle back is, so day 1 is when you start to bleed. What's really happening there is that the entire purpose of the menstrual cycle is your body's trying to get pregnant. Whether you are or not, that is the goal of menstruation, right? Ovulation is to get pregnant. So really what happens is when you bleed, you're excreting your endometrium, your lining. And so pretty much when you're bleeding, you're tanked with every hormone. Estrogen's low, progesterone's low, and both of the stimulating hormones are also low. So that's why when you are actually bleeding, people tend to have some cramps. They maybe have some mood swings. They're a little bit more irritable. So that's why our hormones are all kind of at this 0 range. Now, after your bleed stops, right away what happens is that your brain, your hypothalamus, which is like this master control center, it's getting inputs constantly, right? So it is getting inputs from your ovaries. Your ovaries and your brain are totally connected. And so your ovaries essentially send a signal to your brain that estrogen needs to be produced. We're not having enough estrogen. And so follicle stimulating hormone is then released, which grows an egg. And so that's really the start of the process after you have a bleed, is that your ovaries communicate to your brain, hey, we need some estrogen in here. Your brain secretes FSH, and that is what allows a follicle to grow. And your follicle actually has multiple eggs, but the one that matures the fastest, or essentially is the strongest egg, is the one that would become an embryo if you were to get pregnant. And so essentially that first half of your phase, the follicular phase, named very well because your follicle is growing, your estrogen is going to go up, 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 up. And then at a certain point, what happens is luteinizing hormone is secreted, which says, hey, this egg is mature and it's ready to be kind of distributed down the fallopian tube. And so at that point, LH, there's a big surge of LH. And that is when we enter the second half of the menstrual cycle, the luteal phase. So that point in time where LH is surging is what triggers ovulation to happen. So pretty much that pulse of LH, your egg is released. That's that ovulation, the main event of your menstrual cycle. And then after that, you enter into your luteal phase. And I'll say this, and then I know you probably have some stuff to add, Ellie. And during your luteal phase, LH comes in pulses. And so it's not a consistent like elevation of LH. It really comes in pulses. And the only way you can make progesterone is from ovulation. Your corpus luteum, which forms after you ovulate, that's what happens. That is what secretes progesterone. So if you don't ovulate, you don't make progesterone. And so that's the only way our bodies can make it. Whereas estrogen can be made through like fat cells and other ways, progesterone cannot. So that's the only way our bodies produce it. So you'll notice in the first half of the cycle, pretty much no progesterone. As soon as we have that LH surge and those pulses, progesterone stays elevated. And then if you do become pregnant, then that is going to continue to produce progesterone through HCG. And if you do not get pregnant, then that is when we see the bleed start to happen. The corpus luteum kind of dies essentially, and then you have your bleed. So that's kind of the menstrual cycle 101.
That was so good. Well articulated. So here's my question. I'm going to ask as if the person listening really knows nothing about a period, because I think we assume people know a lot about, especially females, assume they know a lot about their period. And the reality is I didn't know much about it until I really started looking into it when I was in my early 20s. So true or false, women are born with the set amount of eggs that they're going to have for their life.
True.
Okay. So with that in mind, one thing just to simplify it, menarche is going to be your first period. So whether you're 14, 13, whatever it is, that's your first bleed. And then you're going to have a period, hopefully, every month until menopause, which is the cessation of your period. And those are your, in simple terms, childbearing years or potential childbearing years. And so with each period, you're pulling from a set amount of eggs that you had when you were born, unlike males who, they don't have periods. They have sperm forever and they're producing it forever. So they're always fertile. Whereas women, we have fertile windows, right? And it ebbs and flows. So I find to just be fascinating. But my other question is, when you spoke about the bleeding phase, do you know, or off the top of your head, know a typical range for those days of bleeding? Because I know like anything more than like 7 to 9, you need to like talk to your doctor. But what's the typical average in terms of bleeding days?
4 to 8 is what's considered normal for that phase. And I think it's important to say that, I'm going to mess up the way I say that. What is common to a lot of people does not mean it's normal. Mm-hmm. So like people who have excruciating symptoms from their menstrual cycle, like debilitating cramps, they can't go to work, they can't go to school, like that is not normal.
Yeah.
So even though it may be common for you, like you can expect it every cycle, that doesn't mean it's a normal thing that should be happening. So same thing, like if you're bleeding more than 8 days, that's another indication that something else is going on and that you probably need to go see your OBGYN.
Good.
So just knowing these things, and if you talk to other friends and they have the same issues, again, common doesn't mean normal.
Yeah, I think that's really important to note, because you see averages everywhere and it's like there are exceptions. What's professional athlete is going to have a very different, in most times, symptoms and period and perception or cycle length and all that perception of their period than maybe someone who's never worked out a day in their life. And there's other factors as well. So it's just something that you've got to know your body, talk to your doctor, and understand just, I think, the baselines and the averages. But if you're not within those normal limits, that doesn't always mean something's wrong with you. So I think it's just important here to preface, like, we're not doctors, we're not giving medical advice. My overarching theme is, we will get into this later, but do your research, know what the menstrual cycle does, what the purpose is, the norms, and then track your cycle. We will get into this later, but because right now it's just the overview, but that I think is the overarching theme that can help you determine, okay, my normal is not always going to look like someone else's.
Mm-hmm. And something too to kind of circle back is that you are born with your set amount of eggs for life. Until you hit puberty, your brain is essentially shut off. So your ovaries are still like, your bank is going down. Even from the time you're born, before you start your first cycle, your brain is just not working with that connection with your ovary like we talked about. So that's why you're not having a cycle. Mm-hmm. So once you hit puberty, all of your reproductive years, typically you have a normal cycle or you're pregnant. And then when you hit menopause, essentially you've depleted your bank. So your ovaries have dried up of the eggs. So puberty, your brain shut off. And then in menopause, your ovaries kind of shut off or dry up, for lack of better terms. And then you have all your years in the middle.
Yeah. So here's kind of to wrap up this overview section, unless there's anything else we want to interject with. Let's speak a little bit to someone on birth control and kind of hormonal birth control and what that does to our normal. This is super deep, so we don't need to get super into the weeds. But number one, like, why do women stop bleeding when they're on birth control, or any implications we need to speak to as it comes to hormonal birth control and the female cycle?
I think the main thing is that we know birth control, obviously the purpose of it is to not have a child, or a lot of doctors kind of use it as a blanket prescription to regulate cycles or minimize negative symptoms. But what happens is you're not ovulating. And we just talked about ovulation being the main point of having a cycle. And so if you are not ovulating, obviously you cannot get pregnant, but you're also not producing your own progesterone. Mm. And the first half, it's giving you a synthetic estrogen. And so I'm not bashing birth control. Like I truly feel like everyone should even have a choice in it, whether you take it or not. I think it does help some people manage symptoms like of endometriosis, but just for the average person, you shut down your own production of sex hormones and you're relying on a synthetic estrogen and progesterone. So your ovulation stops. So all of the benefits from estrogen and progesterone, you're actually not getting because you're taking a pill form versus your body being able to do it on its own.
Yeah. And just to speak to that really quick. So I have kind of tongue in cheek, but not really, referred to the female menstrual cycle as the sixth vital sign for a female, because it allows you to, in the same way that we have a range for normal heart rate, right? Like 60 to 100 beats per minute. If you're outside of that range, you either need to say, oh, okay, I'm 40 beats per minute because I'm an elite athlete. Or if I'm consistently at my resting heart rate, 112 beats per minute, which is above the high range, maybe I should look into talking to a doctor or something, and just kind of like, it's a red flag, right? Just to, hey, let me look deeper. With the female menstrual cycle, if you're someone who's not on hormonal birth control and you're missing a lot of periods, or you find out that you're having anovulatory cycles, or for whatever reason, your symptoms are really, really bad, way worse than they should be, that is a dashboard light to kind of tell us, hey, something under the hood needs to be investigated. It doesn't mean something's like wrong with you always, but you might have endometriosis. You might have PCOS. You might not be eating enough. You might be like training so high and not recovering at the same level that you need to be. So it's a beautiful thing to be able to look at our body and our cycle and know when something's thrown off so that we can look under the hood and fix what we need to fix. But with hormonal birth control, that's not going to be as you're taking, like Gina said, you're getting synthetic hormones and you're not able to really be as aware of different issues. So I think it's just important to know that that is happening when you're on synthetic hormones. You just need to be aware of that and know, hey, like, am I doing the lifestyle things I should be doing, fueling myself enough, all of that to make sure I'm checking off the boxes that my body otherwise might be alerting me of if I'm not on hormonal birth control.